When you're working with pre-strung beads, the first thing you need to do is string your beads. So I will show you how to do that here. You need your yarn and another nifty dental tool. This is a dental floss threader, and these also come in a package of 50 or something for a few dollars, and it's very useful for stringing on beads. So it just looks like a humongous eye needle, and what you're going to do is put your yarn through the hole there and fold it over like so, and then put on some beads. Now, if you have a shawl or something you're doing and you have, 1,200 beads, you're not going to sit there and pick up 1,200 beads with your fingers and put them on this. What the easiest way to do it is just take the tip and just poke it into the hole and the bead pops right on. That's the easiest way, and you can do a couple at a time and then slide them down onto your yarn. So there's 4 beads or so on there. Then you just take them and you slide them right onto your yarn. Now sometimes, I had wanted to bring this up and I'm glad it happened on the first one. Even when you get really good quality beads, sometimes they're not shaped exactly the same as all the rest of the beads. This bead I'm really fighting with to get on. So that bead hole is probably misshapen or smaller than the other ones, even though by eye it pretty much looks fine. So I'm going to put that one aside. That doesn't happen very often when you buy good beads. That's also why when I string like this, I'll only put 4 or 5 on the threader at a time in case that happens. So that way I don't have 20 on there that I have to yank off. And then you're just going to slide your beads all the way down. What I usually do is I leave a really long tail, because what'll happen is with the yarn being that thick, doubled over, they'll stay on the 2 strands of yarn for a while. And then later I can push them down. That way they're not sliding all over the yarn or, getting in the way of things. They'll stay right there for a while. So let's just do a couple more. So you can see we're just going to poke right in the hole and it'll pop right on. And then you'll take those and shove them down, shove them right over your yarn, and now you've threaded on some beads. Now the next thing with threading on beads, for this project we're going to do, it's not that big of a deal. We only need about 85 beads for the swatch. But if you were doing a shawl that had 1,200 beads or something, or 800 beads, you wouldn't want to sit here and count all 800 beads on the yarn while you're stringing them. So there's a trick you can do, and I'm just going to put a few more on here to show you that trick, because I don't think I'm quite there yet. I love the way they just pop right onto that threader. Might have found another bead that's not right. That's kind of funny, because I did a practice swatch to make up the swatch for the tutorial and never found any of those beads. And now that I wanted to mention it, I found 2 already. So here we have a bunch of beads strung on. What you can do is you can use something called bead gauge. So you take a ruler and you measure out 1 inch of beads, and that's going to be your bead gauge. So then what you can do is, so for example here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 beads per inch. So let's say I needed 1,200 beads and I get 13 beads an inch. I would take 1,200 divided by 13 and that would give me how many inches I would need of beads. That comes out to 92, which probably sounds about right, because if I go backwards, if I have 92 inches of beads times 13 beads per inch, I get 1200. So that's how you can do that. You can just string on a ton and then measure out how many inches you have of beads, and that gives you a really good idea. What I typically do though also is I will put on an extra couple of inches just to be safe and make sure that I have enough on there. Like I talked about before, when you have pre-strung beads, especially if they're in a color format in a certain order, it's very difficult to get more on there since they're actually on the yarn. So string on your 85 beads, and then we'll come back and I will show you 4 different techniques with strung on beads. Alright, now I've got all my beads strung on. If I were doing this for a larger project, I would use a tape measure, not this little ruler. But for 85 beads at 13 beads an inch, I needed about 6.5 inches, and here I probably have about 7, so that's plenty. It's always fine if you put on more beads, because once you're done with your project, you cut the yarn and you detach the project from the yarn, then you can recover the beads and put them back. So we're ready to go for this. And all you need to do, I still have the tail here that I was talking about, so all you need to do is slide your beads on past the tail onto one strand of yarn, and then take your dental floss threader out and you're ready to go. And you put that away. And now we're going to start this swatch. So for this swatch, because you can do a couple of different things with strung beads, we're going to cast on with beads. And there's probably several different ways to do this. I'm just going to show you one, and it's with the backward loop cast on, and you'll see why in a minute. So the first thing you do for a backward loop cast on is you make a slip knot, like so. If you've never made a slip knot before, I'll do that again, but most knitters use them. So you have your tail end, you go around and through with your tail end, and that's your loop. It's going to go on your needle, and then you pull the knot tight. Slip knot done properly, if you pull the tail, it should make the loop smaller or larger. So take your needle and you can pull that tightly from the tail, and we're going to cast on 3 stitches backward loop. So to do that, you just take your working yarn, not your tail, and grab the yarn with your thumb and index finger around your middle finger and flip those around and stick the needle through that loop and then pull it tight. So we have 3 on there now. Now we're going to place 3 beads. So to place beads from stranded yarn, you just need to grab them. I have 3 beads there, and pull them up the yarn. And we're going to pull that right to the needle. And now I'm going to cast on another 3 stitches. I'm going to do it a little loosely on the first stitch because I don't want this yarn that the beads are on to be so tight that they don't dangle at all. So we'll do this one a little loosely so that they drape nicely. You don't want to do it super tight. You also don't want to do it super loose, but okay, there's 3 more, and then we're going to place 3 more beads. So I'm just going to grab 3 more beads and pull them down, and then cast on 3 more stitches. And repeat. We're going to do this 5 times for 5 sets of 3 beads. Pull up some beads. Cast on 3 more stitches. And pull up 3 more beads. So now we've got 4. We need 1 more, excuse me, allergies are bothering me today. 3 more beads, and then we're going to cast on 3 more stitches. And that's one way that you can cast on with beads. And for this swatch I'm going to continue with this method a little bit, and we're going to knit though and then place beads. So this one, while we're knitting, is going to be placing beads in between stitches and not on stitches. So the beads are floating on the yarn in between the stitches. So I'm just going to shove my beads down a little bit so I have some more yarn to work with. And I'll turn this over. And we're going to knit 3 stitches. The backward loop gets a little tricky on the first row. So just make sure you're not splitting the stitches and you're getting your needle in there. So I've knit to my strand that's holding the beads, and now I'm going to slip up 3 more beads. I'm going to do 1 row of 3 after the cast on for 2 rows of 3, and then we're going to do 2 rows of 2 and 2 rows of 1 for the swatch. So I've brought up 3 more beads here that you can see behind. And then to continue, it's just the same idea as the cast on. I'm going to knit into the next stitch, but I'm not going to pull it super tight because I want those beads to have something to float on. So I'm going to knit 3 stitches, and I split one there. Now you can see your beads that are floating there. And what happens with this method is each row kind of favors one side versus the other. That's why for the swatch I did 2 of each number of beads, so you could see that happen. So the cast on edge is favoring this side that's more facing us, and the row I just knit is facing the back. So that's why with this method too, it's nice to do it equally on both sides, because then if your item is reversible, either way that it's laying, you're seeing the beads, and then you see the beads behind it. So you can go ahead and finish the couple of rows with these beads stranded in between stitches. Then we'll come back and we'll do a different technique. Okay, now we're ready for the next part of the swatch. So as you can see, we've got 6 rows of beads here, and like I was saying, they favor one side or the other depending on which row you're working on, because here it looks like I've only got 3, and then we have this one in the background, but there's really 6 because on the other side it's the same. So it's always good to double those up when you do that. I don't know if there's a name for this particular stitch, but so I've done that, and then I've knit 2 rows. So now I'm back on this side to do something else. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to place beads on garter stitches. So we're going to knit 3, place a bead, knit 2, 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 place a bead. That way the beads will kind of line up with what we've already got going on. And I will also try and show you how I pull up beads, because I usually don't put my work down every time. I'm just doing that so you can see it on the camera. And I have a table here in my way, so it might be a little awkward. But I will try to show you. So now I'm just going to knit 3. Now I'm going to place a bead on this stitch. What I usually do is I hold both needles with this hand, and then I grab wherever my beads are on my yarn, pull it up to this hand. For this one I only need a bead, so I'm just going to grab a bead with this hand. If I needed more, I would just grab more. And then I'm just going to pull the yarn right through, and there's my bead. That's how I do it if I'm actually sitting here knitting a beaded project. So to place a bead on a knit stitch, we have our bead there closer to the needle, and we're going to make the stitch with the bead there on the loop and pop it through. And you just want to make sure, like that just happened, that the bead is on the front of the work. If the bead is on the back, it's going to show on the back of the work when you do that. Sometimes you have to poke them through yourself with your fingers. Sometimes it doesn't go that easily. It's especially important for stockinette stitch that the beads place properly, because since the beads are just floating on the yarn in stockinette, they can actually travel over stitches and end up somewhere else after you've used the item or washed it. So let's do a couple more of those. I'm going to knit 2 stitches. And now I'm ready for another bead. I'm going to pull my yarn over here, grab a bead, slide the yarn through, there's my bead. I'm going to knit that stitch. And here's where my bead didn't pop through so easily. So I need to get that bead to pop through. Just gonna poke it through myself. See, right now that bead is actually in the strand in between, and that's what can happen if they travel after you've placed them. So I'm actually gonna unknit that stitch and try it again. There we go, now it popped through. So it can be a little fiddly, and then on the way back you have to make sure that they're not on the other side. This one's already moving. If this one moved all the way to the back, and then I knit that stitch, then that bead would show on the back of the work. So you always have to fiddle with your beads a little bit. That one's on the back. And we'll do one more. 2 stitches. I'm going to grab a bead. Give it a little room. Knit the stitch. And my bead didn't come through. So I'm going to try it again. There we go. So what you want to do is what I just did there. I just saw where the bead was and kind of scooped it with my needle tip to get it to the front. So now we're going to place 5 of these beads on this row, and then we're going to come back and we will do some beads in stockinette stitch, just so you can see the difference how they sit on garter stitch versus stockinette. Okay, now we're ready for the stockinette stitch beads. Here's our garter beads, and this is what your swatch should look like right now if you're up to this point. So what I did was I finished the garter beads, I knit 2 rows, and then on the return row I knit 3, purled 12, and knit 3. So we have some border stitches here for the stockinette portion, so it'll sit flat. So you can put markers in here now if you want to mark off the garter stitch border, but you don't have to, that's up to you. And now we're gonna knit 3 for the border. And then we're going to knit 2 and place a bead across the row. Now we're going to place a bead, and it's pretty much the same as we were doing in garter stitch, it's just in stockinette, so you can see on the swatch how it looks different. Knit this stitch, the bead to pop through, and knit 2, place a bead, and continue across. Once you get used to the beads, it becomes a lot easier to get them to pop through the stitch. See, here I have the bead. I'm going to wrap the yarn around. I can see the bead there, just popped through, so then I'll scoop the yarn and finish my stitch. One more bead. And that's it for that row. So as I said before, just make sure when you do the return row that your beads are still on this side and they haven't traveled to the back side while you're finishing that row. And then we're gonna get up to the next point where we're gonna strand beads across and do some slip stitch beading. Alright, now we're ready for some slip stitch stranded beading. And as you can see here, one of my beads traveled and it's no longer on the knit stitch, it's in between 2 stitches. And that can happen. I probably didn't get it really well when I made the knit stitch, and so it traveled while I was knitting the rest of the rows. We can fix it. When I block the swatch and show you how to block it, I'll show you how to fix it. But that would be a real problem if you had a ton of beads that did that. So now I've just purled back, and then I knit a few more rows to put some space in between so we can see clearly. And that's all on the pattern for the swatch. If you're knitting along, just follow that pattern. And now we can do some slip stitch beading. So I'm going to knit the 3 border stitches. Get some yarn here. I'm going to knit 3 more. And now I'm going to slip a bead. So I'm going to bring a bead up. And I'm going to bring the yarn forward with the bead on it. I'm going to slip the next stitch and then put the yarn to the back to work the next stitch. Then I'm going to knit 2. And we're going to do that again, but this time I'm going to bring forward 2 beads. going to slip 2 stitches. So I'm going to bring the yarn forward with the beads. I'm going to slip 2 stitches, put the yarn to the back again, and then knit another stitch, and another, and then we'll do one more. Bring up a bead, bring the yarn forward with the bead, slip the stitch, bring the yarn to the back, sure my bead doesn't go to the back, and then knit. And there we go. There's some slip stitch beading. So that's a little different. And you can see the difference is the beads sit flat along the strand in the front of the work. And when you place a bead on a knit stitch, because it's on one leg of the stitch, it tends to bias one way or the other. So now all we have left to do is knit a couple rows to get some space, and then we're going to do a beaded bind off. Alright, now we've knit a few more rows just to get some space, and now we're going to do a beaded bind off. There's lots of different ways to do beaded bind offs. This one is a lace bind off that's good for lace because it has a lot of give and stretches quite a bit. So we're going to do that one, and if you're interested in other ones, you can just search on the internet because I'm sure there's plenty, or look in some lace books. So what we're going to do is, it's kind of similar to a regular bind off in that you work 2 stitches, but instead of slipping and passing them over, we're going to knit them together, and on the beaded portions we're going to use a bead. So for the beginning of the bind off, I'm going to knit 2 stitches. So I have 2 stitches there, and then I'm going to go into the front of those 2 stitches so that I can knit into the back loop. I'm going to bring up a bead, so there's my bead, and then I'm going to knit into the back loop of these. And I want the bead to pop through too, so here's where you have to manipulate it a little bit. So there's my bead. So I want my bead sitting like that on the front of this stitch that I've worked these 2 together. So now there's my bead. So now we're going to do this for every other set of stitches, so we'll do a few more. So the next set I'm just going to do plain without a bead. So I'm going to knit that stitch. I'm going to go into the front of the 2 stitches. I'm going to knit those together, or try to. And there's my bead. It's going to sit on the bind off. I'm going to knit another stitch. I'm going to knit these 2 together with the bead. Again, you just want to poke the bead through so that it pops through, and then that one's done. Alright, one more time. I did have to pause the camera there and go fight with my yarn and beads. So for this swatch, you pretty much want a bead on there, whatever you're working. So for example here, I'm going to knit the next stitch together with this one I just worked, that's still, these 2 are on the needles, I'm going to drop off in a second. That has a bead on it already. Then the next one, I'm going to place a bead. So you pretty much are going to have a bead on all the time. Depends on what project you're doing, how many stitches you work in between each bead, but for this swatch it's going to pretty much be you either just worked a bead and you're working the stitch that has a bead on it, or you're putting a bead on it. So I'm going to drop off these 2 stitches. And there's my bead. I'm going to knit this one, which is now backwards because I fought with it. And I'm going to knit these two together without placing another bead because there's already a bead on there. And now for the next one, I'm going to knit a stitch. And then I'm going to put another bead on these two. And again, usually I'm not knitting with a camera tripod hunched over with it in between my legs. It's a little awkward. I'm going to bring up a bead. And knit these two together. And I split my yarn, so let's try that again. The easiest way to do it is to try and slide the bead as close as possible so that when you pull this yarn through, that bead pops through as well. Easier said than done. You don't really want it in the front because it'll be in the back. You kind of want it right under the needle like that. Alright, there's my yarn. My bead did not come with. So I'm just going to pop it through. Come on, bead. There we go. Just pop it through. And that is how you do this particular beaded bind off. So I'm going to finish this off and then show you how to block your swatches. And when we block this one, I will fix the stitch that popped through.